Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to today's Learn at Lunch webinar. Today, we will hear from Extension Ag economist Dr. Rodney Jones as he discusses prospects for double cropping. If you have a question during the webinar, you may ask it through the chat window by clicking the chat button at the bottom of the screen. Additional farm management resources are available on the eFarm Management page. I will share this link in the chat window. Dr. Jones, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Brent, and I'd like to welcome everyone here this afternoon on the webinar. I think I know everyone on the meeting today except Shylan. I don't know Shylan, but good to see you, Fred. Good to see you, Chad, Doug. Appreciate you joining us. And Shylan, hope to meet up with you as well. Just wanted to share a few thoughts. Periodically, we try to do a webinar to kind of talk about the prospects for the economics of certain agricultural production systems. And this time of year, I think what's on a lot of people's minds would be prospects for planting something after wheat harvest, or maybe after canola harvest, and how that might look. When Brent and I first started talking about a topic for this month's webinar, it was pretty dry and the prospects were looking pretty grim for even the full season spring planted crops. And now here we are just a few short weeks later, and things have changed dramatically in terms of the production prospects. But let's just talk about a few issues that might drive some of these decisions on our farms and ranches here in Oklahoma. So of course, it's all about weather and prices in terms of the economics of these production systems. So we'll kind of look at what commodity prices have done, maybe not just over the last few months, but really relative to the last few years when producers were making these kinds of decisions. So we'll kind of look at that a little bit. I think most people know what has happened to commodity prices. Maybe look at some of what's happened to some of the cost components that go into producing some of these crops. Some of those cost components have come down a little bit. That's a welcome relief. And then, of course, weather and especially soil moisture conditions. And I think in most parts of the state that would be interested in looking at a double crop system, those conditions are maybe a little more favorable than they have been in the past few years. Not everywhere. There are still some dry pockets out in northwest Oklahoma, but certainly west central, north central, and a little further south, we've got a little better soil moisture prospects than maybe we had a year ago or a couple of years ago. So those are kind of the things that are going to drive the decision. This is just a kind of a daily chart of corn prices. I don't really talk a whole lot about corn as a double crop option. I know there are some producers who do that and look at it, but I show the corn chart mostly because it's going to be representative of another popular double cropping option, which would be grain sorghum or milo. This is a daily chart, so it doesn't give you a picture really compared to a year ago or 2 years ago, but we're kind of looking at futures in that 460, 470 range on the December corn. If we compare that to, say, a year ago or 2 years ago, we're about $1 lower than we were, and that's of course about a 20% a drop from the prospects looking at it a year or so ago. So prices are certainly not working in our favor in terms of looking at the prospects for some of these cropping operations. Local basis, not particularly weak, not particularly strong right at this moment. We're kind of at a little bit more of a long-term average basis projection. That could certainly change. If local conditions improve for cropping prospects, that's probably going to result in our basis getting a little weaker or a little worse. If local conditions are not very favorable for fall crop production as the summer progresses, that's probably going to result in a strengthening of our basis. But right now we're not getting any really strong signals from the basis component of price. And of course, like I just mentioned, futures are probably roughly $1 lower than they were a year or so ago. So depending on where you're at in Oklahoma, if you're kind of up there in that Enid area, you might be looking at a price projection of 470, 480 for milo or corn this fall. If you're at some of the other locations where you have a little more of a transportation cost to endure, that's going to be 20 or maybe 25 cents lower than that. So somewhere in the mid to upper fours is probably what we're looking at in terms of a milo or corn price. And again, significantly lower than a year or so ago. We look at another popular option that might be something like a soybean, and I can't really show all of the options that that somebody might be considering planting, but two of the popular options would be either milo or soybeans. This is a longer term chart, goes back several years, so we can get a little better historical perspective here. We're looking at November futures in kind of that 1180 range. Certainly a year ago, we were $1 higher than that. A couple years ago, we were almost a couple dollars higher than that. But in percentage terms, that's not as big of a price decline as what we've seen for the corn market, but certainly not as strong as we were a year or so ago from a price perspective. Of course, our basis is quite a bit wider for soybeans, always has been. Again, nothing unusual about the basis right now for local bids for soybeans, but we do have about a -60, -70 basis in the Enid area anyway. So that's going to imply about 1125 to 1150 might be a reasonable expectation for our fall price for soybeans. Again, that's maybe $1 lower than it was a year ago, but in percentage terms, that's not as much lower as it is for milo or corn. So then on the other side of the coin, if we're just kind of looking at it as a budgeting exercise, we've got to look at the cost projections. Several years ago, we used to kind of throw out that number, $200 an acre, to plant pretty much any crop that we traditionally grow in Oklahoma. We're certainly higher than that, and we're higher than that even on these double crop systems where we don't typically put quite as many inputs into the production process. But we're probably looking at $220 to $240 an acre just to cover our what I would call non-land costs to produce a double crop grain sorghum crop. We might be able to lower that a little bit in some areas, but certainly our costs are higher than they were a few years ago. Soybeans about the same, maybe just a little bit lower on the cost side because we don't typically put supplemental nitrogen fertilizer on our soybeans like we would our grain sorghum. Of course, seed costs are going to be higher on soybeans, but we save a little bit on our fertility costs. So not too far apart there. It's going to be a little over $200 an acre, not including the land charge. And we're going to talk just a little bit about land costs, rental costs in a double crop situation, because that's always been kind of a source of confusion or a source of discussion when people are thinking about double cropping systems. What do you do in terms of assigning a land charge or compensating the landowner for rent? So when we combine those price projections and the cost projections, we can kind of use a budgeting exercise to come up with a a break-even yield projection. Our low-cost double crop grain sorghum producers, probably looking at a break even there around 47 to 51, somewhere in that high 40s, low 50s, depending on what all you plug in there in terms of costs, and of course, depending on your uh, uh, yields and so forth. But in order just to cover all costs, you're probably going to need somewhere around 50 bushels. That's not too far away from where it's kind of always been historically. Few years ago when we had a little higher prices on the output side, I was getting some of those break-even double crop milo projections down around 40. Now we're probably pushing that 50 mark a little bit. Same thing on the soybean side, a little higher break-even yields than we've had for the last couple of years, somewhere in that 18 to 20 bushel range. So, double cropping in many parts of Oklahoma is a little bit riskier prospect than some of our full season crops. We typically don't plug in quite as high of a yield expectation. But these are certainly doable yields in a decent production year. It just depends on how much you're willing to gamble on that weather phenomenon. So when you kind of plug that in with our expected yields, that leaves a pretty slim margin. Not a lot of economic profit potential for average producers. That shouldn't surprise anyone. One of the basic tenets of economics is we don't really expect to be able to project above average or abnormally high profits. That profit potential pretty much gets bid out of any enterprise that we engage in. But we're kind of sitting right there about a break even projection for the average producer. We can produce a little bit higher yields, lower our costs a little bit, maybe snag just a little bit higher price. If we get a price bump, there might be a little bit of room for some higher than average profits. So that's going to be the key, and that shouldn't be a surprise. That's kind of always the case. There is a little bit of reluctance out there because we've had a couple of bad years in a row in many areas of Oklahoma, kind of that north central, northwestern region, especially. We've suffered from some heat and not a whole lot of moisture the last couple of summers, and that's really kind of cut into some of our double crop systems. So understandably so, there's a little bit of reluctance out there, a little bit of caution. But on the other hand, we're kind of going into the double cropping season with maybe a little better soil moisture. I was just looking at the Mesonet late yesterday afternoon and this morning, looking at those long range weather forecasts. And of course, we know that once we get beyond about a week or so, those weather forecasts are not terribly accurate, but the long-term projection is kind of for about average temperatures and about average precipitation over much of the state of Oklahoma. And now that we have pretty decent soil moisture to start the process, I'd say we might be in a little better shape than we've been for the last couple of years right here at planting time, if we can get the wheat or canola harvested and get in there and get some of these crops planted into this good moisture. So maybe a little better weather forecast, but again, a tremendous amount of uncertainty around that. I know some of the folks I got off the sprayer in the middle of the night last night, had pretty good spraying conditions last night to put on some pre-emerge up there in north central Oklahoma on some full season summer crops. And when I came in and turned on the TV, they were talking about the horrendous rains down there in the south part of Oklahoma City and southeast of Oklahoma City. I hope we don't have that to contend with. an overabundance of moisture, but for most of the areas that would be considering a double crop system, we've got pretty good soil moisture right at the moment. It's just a matter of getting this wheat crop off and getting in there and getting the crop planted, if at all possible. Some possibilities, some things to look at in a double crop system. Of course, we just kind of go down through the budgeting exercise and look at all the cost components. Seed costs, they kind of are what they are. Of course, that's going to be higher for soybeans or something like that than it would be for grain sorghum. That's been one of the reasons people kind of like grain sorghum, is the low seed cost component. It is what it is. We can't do much to manage that. We can and do have some opportunities for managing our fertilizer expenses. And one good way to do that is to not put the full load on right at planting time, especially if you're thinking about grain sorghum. Kind of wait until that crop gets off and running and see, we got another month or another 6 weeks into the summer, kind of see what the growing conditions look like, and go out there and top dress if conditions still look favorable, or hold off on that and save that additional $20 or $30 if conditions don't look quite as favorable. So we can manage the fertilizer cost a little bit as conditions evolve. Harvest costs, of course, they're higher than they were a few years ago. Not much we can do about that. Pesticide costs on our double cropping systems. I think when I first started working in Oklahoma 12, 13 years ago, or I guess it's been more than that now, been about 15 or 16 years ago, we kind of tried to stay on the low cost side of things in our double crop systems in terms of herbicide application, pre-emerge herbicide, those kinds of things. I think that kind of came back to bite us a little bit. And so I'm not going to encourage trying to cut too many costs in that arena. We do have to get adequate weed control, and our pre-emerge herbicide packages for both grain sorghum and soybeans and corn, for that matter, are not going to be cheap. They're going to cost about the same as they do for the full season crops. Crop insurance is an additional cost to consider. Of course, depending on what county you're in, whether that's even available for you for a specific crop. In many areas of north central Oklahoma, we now do have double crop insurance for both grain sorghum and soybeans. That's kind of been evolving, and it depends on what county you're in. Machinery operations, just as with all cropping operations, total machinery costs have been rising rapidly the last couple of years. Of course, there's a lot of reasons why we want to minimize machinery operations in our double crop systems, preserving moisture being one. We don't want to impose too much tillage on that system, simply for the fact of losing that moisture as we open up that ground. But we do still have to get it planted. We have to get it sprayed. Have to get it harvested. Those kinds of things, and those are expenses that we just can't cut. There's just no way around it. Interest costs. If you look at the percentage of that total cost package, that $200 plus to on a per acre basis to plant any of these crops, interest is still not a huge component, but it's twice as big a component as it was 2 or 3 years ago. So if we were looking at a couple dollars an acre in interest charges on those variable costs, now we're looking at twice that, looking at $4, $5, $6 an acre just in interest. Miscellaneous, that's just all those overhead costs. They don't amount to a whole lot. The big one that we probably ought to have a little bit of a discussion about as it pertains to double crop is what to do with rent, or what to allocate as a land charge. If you're doing full cost accounting and you own the land, what do you put on there for an opportunity cost? So let's talk about that. It's something we've been talking about really all of my career. How do you handle rent in a double crop situations? It's certainly one of the most common questions I've gotten pertaining to double cropping throughout my career. Um, how do we handle that? And there's a variety of different ways we can answer that question. One thing I do know that is uh, uh, basically unequivocal, no doubt about it. If you're sharecropping a piece of ground, your traditional crop share split just simply will not work for the operator in a double crop scenario. You're just incurring too many costs, and the landlord is basically getting more than their fair share of that potential additional crop. So that has been one of the biggest impediments to crop rotations in general, and certainly double cropping in Oklahoma, has been a reluctance to have a discussion about what to do on share crop land when you're trying to do some kind of a double crop operation. I have my own opinion, and I have the way we do things on our farm, but you just can't give the landlord a third or 2/5 of your double crop milo crop or double crop soybean crop and have any chance of having that be economically viable for the operator. There's a lot of different points of view on the rent issue in general. My preference is to just consider a small contribution for the double cropping activity. Maybe if your full season rent is $55 an acre on a piece of ground, and your landlord has been paid that for whatever the primary crop for a given year is. If you double crop it, maybe offer to give them a $10 bonus or something along that line. Maybe even 15 might be fair, but you certainly can't give them another 55, and you can't give them a third of the crop, but maybe just give them a little cash rent bump. A lot of disagreement as to whether double cropping enhances or takes away from the yield of the full season crop. I've seen it work both ways. It just depends on the year, depends on the weather. Some years it helps, some years it hurts. Introducing that crop diversity is uh, certainly normally a good thing, but in the wrong kind of year with the wrong kind of moisture patterns, you can certainly see it maybe pull a little bit away from the full season crop the following year or whatever. So I think it might be fair to compensate the landlord a little bit, but I'll leave that up to each individual producer to figure out how they're going to do that. Of course, one of the big reasons why we do double cropping in general is just to introduce some crop diversity. There's been a lot of talk about cover crops the last several years, and the difficulty in making what has been considered to be the traditional cover crop systems that are used in areas of the United States that get more moisture throughout the entire growing season. The difficulty in making those kinds of systems work in a state like Oklahoma, kind of an in-between situation where we can capture some of those benefits of the cropping diversity while still having something to sell is through a double crop system, and to transition to planting a full season spring crop, of course, the next year have been kind of the primary reasons why we engage in double cropping to begin with. So it's not all about trying to make a large profit on the double crop per se. We're going to incur some of those costs, whether we plant a crop on the ground or not. We're going to have to control the weeds, so we're going to have either some tillage or some herbicide costs. So how you allocate those, is it just managing the land, getting ready for the next year's crop, or is it managing the land to try to produce a double crop to maybe get a little bit of return for some of those costs that we're going to have to incur anyway. So that makes the budgeting process a little more complicated. I think most producers that I talk to, uh, you know, good weather, bad weather, good prices, bad prices, they just kind of try to stick with the system that has worked year in and year out, more often than not. So I think a lot of our producers are kind of going to stick with what they've historically done. But it might be helpful to kind of look at how that might pan out this year. On the revenue side, market price moves are just huge from a historical perspective. You know, a few days ago, wheat went up 25 cents. Then the next day, it was down about half that. A day or so ago, it went up 19. Then it's back down several cents. Just huge marketing swings, and in some of the other crops, we've seen even larger swings than that. So as always, you know, as the growing season evolves, if it looks like you've got prospects for a decent crop out there, and you get a little bit of a rally in the market, you know, there might be an opportunity to get another 40 or 50 cents compared with the current price projection. Of course, a little bit of caution on that. We're a little bit less certain of our final yield, even till a little later in the growing season on some of these double cropping systems. So don't overextend yourself too much in terms of forward pricing. So just kind of to summarize, I don't know whether I've told you anything that you didn't already know or weren't already thinking about, but just from a production standpoint, soil conditions, moisture conditions, prospects in many areas of our state are better than they've been for a few years. Prices are a little worse than they've been for a few years. So the margin projections are a little bit tight. Costs a few more dollars to put anything out there, full season crop, double crop. There's just more investment per acre. There is maybe a little more opportunity for cost management, especially on the fertility side. In a double crop system, you just don't have to put all that fertilizer out there until you get a little better handle on what the growing conditions are going to be. And there might be an opportunity to capture a little bit of a market upswing. So I think that's about all I have. We do thank you for your participation. I know Brent is posting this link in the chat box, but you can post any questions, give us any feedback. There's a link to a little survey about the webinar today, and post any questions you have in the chat box. And I'm going to stop sharing my slide. And then I'll be able to see the chat box, or Brent can fill me in on any questions that have come in. Thank you for being here today.
As Dr. Jones mentioned, I did share the link to the webinar survey in the chat window. You guys may all unmute yourself to ask questions of Dr. Jones, or you can type them in the chat window as well. Fred says, have a great day. Keep up the good work. And Chad Webb said, great job.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate you.
If there are no other questions and all in the webinar, thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Brent.